I'm going to start by telling you a couple of instances of God's miraculous provision for Fred as he made his way across Africa. The first thing he needed, what desperately, was a saddle for his ox. He had long distances to go, and he, if possible, wanted to ride an ox for at least part of the way. He had some. He was a good seamstress, good at sewing, and he made every effort to make a saddle, but just couldn't get something that was appropriate. What he had some canvas, and it just made a very hot and sweaty thing to ride on, which was just inappropriate, was just not the sort of thing that he could have ridden a great distance on. And while he was thinking about this and wondering what to do, a man with a good Portuguese accent, a man came to him with a letter written in good Portuguese, and this letter offered him a saddle. He had tried desperately in Benguela at the coast, where there was this decent-sized city, to buy a saddle, and there just wasn't one, as far as he could see, in the country at all. But here suddenly was an offer of a saddle, and just behind the offer, a boy carrying the saddle. Probably some Dutch hunter horse had died, and he had had to abandon its saddle, and now this was being offered to him. And then, perhaps an even more remarkable story is the miracle of the boots. He arrived in Bihé, that was right up in the interior of the country, with shoes that had holes at the bottom, and the uppers were rotten, and he tried as he could. He couldn't make anything of them. He couldn't make anything like a pair of shoes from from the material he had. Everything was just rotten. He tried to buy footwear when he was down at the coast in Benguela, but there was just none to be had, nothing that would fit him at all. And then suddenly a young man arrived, and he said to him, "Would you like a pair of boots?" And right behind the young man was an African with a boy with a fine pair of boots. When he tried to put the boots on, they fitted perfectly, and he now had a superior pair of boots. And how this happened? Well, they'd been bought by a native trader, given to a chief. The chief had hardly worn them, they didn't fit him, and so they were sent to him for him to purchase. And another story concerns food just at the nick of time. This took place in the interior, up in the highlands of Central Africa. And Fred was going to go to take a team of young men to evangelize villages. There had been very, very heavy rains, and they had to cross a swampy area in order to get to where the villages were. The villages were above the water level. They had gone up to high ground, and they wanted to try and reach them before nightfall. Well, it soon became apparent that they were not going to get there by nightfall at all. And they had, by this time, completely run out of food and were pretty desperate. And so Fred decided that he was just going to demonstrate the power of God, because they were arguing that why here we are going out to evangelize, going out to do God's work, and this is how he treats us. We don't have any food, and we're going to have to spend the night under appalling conditions, wet conditions, without anything to eat. So Fred prayed out loud, "Father, please provide us with food." Almost within 10 minutes of him saying that, he spotted a patch of palms which were growing out of an old anthill. And that provided a little bit of fairly dry conditions. And then suddenly an animal, an antelope, broke out of that very area and came running towards them. It had got their scent, and when it began to run, it didn't know where they were. And it ran towards them, got fairly close, and then suddenly saw them and stopped. And that gave Fred a very, very easy shot, and they had their meat for that night. And the next day they were able to continue and to reach the people that they were seeking to evangelize. The first African tribe that my father wanted to help to evangelize were cannibals. Officially, cannibalism had been put down in what was then the Belgian Congo. But in fact, the Belgians had got it all wrong, as I shall explain shortly, and it was very much alive and well, and many, many people were being killed and eaten. The cannibals had an interesting way of looking at things. First of all, they could not understand Europeans eating chicken, because after all, chickens are scavengers. They just pick up things from the ground, and they're just dirty scavengers. So why eat chickens? People, on the other hand, men and women and children. Well, they are much more particular in what they eat. And so therefore, to eat people means that you're eating something that is much more clean and much more healthy. And so they reasoned the best thing to do is to eat humans. And large numbers of humans ended up in the pot. Now the Belgians made a profound mistake. They thought that if they got hold of these erstwhile cannibals and gave them a uniform and gave them rifles, they could then use them as a police force in order to help to subjugate what is now the Congo. They had very few officers, very few people to do this, and these cannibals, well, they were fighters all right, and they could be used for this purpose. And so they got these erstwhile cannibals, gave them a uniform, gave them guns, and then set them up to police that part of the Congo. What, of course, they didn't realize was that they were still cannibals at heart. And unless you change the heart, you don't change the person at all. And the result of that was that many of the Belgian officers ended up as soup. Now I'm going to tell you the story of one cannibal who was a friend of, or who was known to the person my dad worked with very closely, Dan Crawford. This man was a chief called Swiver, and he had the misfortune of having a chieftainship which included a stretch of road which was used by large numbers of people, including cannibals and the Belgians themselves and so on. Now, unfortunately, many of these people who were using these roads were absolute blackguards, and they were constantly raiding and making a thorough nuisance of themselves, stealing things, and so on. And Chief Swiver got more and more downhearted, and eventually he decided that it would be better that he were dead. And he then thought of a cunning plan. He would fake death and then somehow hide away so that he couldn't be found, because he just couldn't stand what was going on. So one night, he clothed himself in about 6 different bits of clothing, almost all the clothing that he had. And he then put himself in what we shall call a coffin. It wasn't really a coffin at all, but it was the nearest they would have to it. And he then pretended that he was dead. Well, he was a chief. I might ask the question, why didn't he just commit suicide if he was so upset with the way things had happened and life for him just was no longer worth living? Well, the reason was that it was just not right for a chief to commit suicide. Others could, but if you were a chief, that was that was a dig. So he decided instead that he was going to fake his death. He got into this position where he was in, as it were, in a place of burial. And he waited until, as he thought, the people would have, as he thought, things died down, and then he was going to try and get away and just live somewhere quietly where nobody would realize who he was. But then an unfortunate turn of events took place which he hadn't bargained on. Suddenly he heard the approach of a group of Wiccans, what we can only call brigands, who were on their way along that road, and they were a raiding party. And when they got to where he was, they suddenly realized that there was potential meat there. They decided that they were going to eat him. Now he waited a bit, hoping that his friends and his own people would manage to keep them from doing this, but no. Gradually he realized that they were in fact serious, and they were going to eat him. And then he heard a dirge, which he had heard often enough, but when he was going to eat other people. And this dirge basically said, "We honor you with internment, with mouth interment. In other words, we are going to honor you by eating you." He then realized that he was in deep trouble. And then he saw, he could just see the glint of a knife, which was about to be plunged into him, and he took fright and leapt up, despite all the clothes that were on him. Now, the people who were going to eat him, of course, thought he was dead. And when he suddenly leapt up like this, they took fright and they ran for it. And he now was able to strip off his all the clothes, and he became a model chief. Nobody was prepared to take him on again. Here was a chief that had risen from the dead, and he ruled his people wisely and well for a long time thereafter.